Unit 6, Lesson 5, The Cuban Missile Crisis. Unit 6, Lesson 5, Vocabulary. The Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuba was an island nation about 90 miles from the southern coast of Florida. Traditionally, Cuba has been a U.S. ally, as it has U.S. business interests and even a U.S. military base at Guantanamo Bay, located on the island. That all began to change in the late 1950s when Fidel Castro led an uprising to overthrow a brutal Cuban dictator who was backed by America. At first, Americans looked at Castro's revolution as an attempt to introduce democracy, but Fidel Castro soon made agreements with the Soviet Union and planned to make Cuba a communist nation and install himself as president and dictator. Soon, Castro began to nationalize all American businesses on the island of Cuba. Castro soon begins an alliance with Nikita Khrushchev, premier of the Soviet Union, who offers aid in September of 1959 to Cubans and Fidel Castro. Castro accepts the aid, and in 1960, the United States begins plotting against Fidel Castro and breaks off all diplomatic ties with the island nation. In the early 1960s, Castro encourages other Latin American countries to have communist revolutions and to fight off their long-held colonizing powers, the United States, Great Britain, France, and Spain. It was America's plans to overthrow Castro, which brings us to the Bay of Pigs invasion or incident. President Eisenhower approved a secret plan in the 1960s to overthrow Fidel Castro using Cuban exiles. When John F. Kennedy became president, defeating Richard Nixon, he decided to continue with the plan. The Cuban exiles landed in Cuba but were quickly defeated by the Cuban military. President Kennedy at this time refused to provide air support, since it would openly tie the United States to the Bay of Pigs invasion. This failed invasion was an embarrassment of foreign policy and for the American military, who trained the Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and relieve Fidel Castro of power. And it became a huge embarrassment on President Kennedy's administration. So this is tied to the United States efforts of containment in Cuba. Containment of spreading communism did not work out so well in the Pacific, and it did not work out so well in Cuba. As Fidel Castro took over U.S. businesses and the United States broke off diplomatic relations in 1961, April of 1961, we have the Bay of Pigs incident where CIA trained Cuban exiles, around 1,400 of them, attempted to overthrow Castro, and their plan failed miserably. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion was an embarrassment to the United States and helped cement Fidel Castro's popularity in Cuba. So in the fall of 1962, at this point, Cuba has now received thousands of Soviet missiles, jets, boats, and personnel to help install the missiles and other equipment on the island nation of Cuba. At this time, Soviet Premier Leader Nikita Khrushchev had repeatedly promised that the Soviet Union would never send offensive weapons or weapons of first strike capability to Cuba. U.S. intelligence analysts believed that Khrushchev would keep his word. They believed he was telling the truth and that he didn't want to arm Cuba with first strike capability. But in 1961 and 1962, U.S. spy planes flying over Cuba revealed that Castro was secretly building missile silos with nuclear warheads capable of first strike capability, aimed directly at the United States. When complete, these missile silos would allow the Soviets the ability to launch missiles from only 90 miles from the U.S. mainland. President Kennedy was determined to prevent this from happening. October 14th, 1962, U.S. U-2 spy planes take photos of suspected USSR missile sites in Cuba. These sites that were nearing completion, and experts believed that they could be ready in only 7 days' time. That the Soviet Union, within 7 days of these spy photos, would be giving Cuba access to first strike capabilities with missiles aimed directly at the United States. U.S. spy planes also identified 20 Soviet ships bound for Cuba carrying missiles and launch equipment. This is one of the actual aerial photos taken November 1962 of Soviet missiles and Soviet launch equipment, Cuban fuel trailers and fuel trucks in and around the island nation of Cuba, aimed directly at the United States. On October 20th, President Kennedy decides to quarantine Cuba. This is, in essence, a naval blockade of the island of Cuba by the United States Navy. At this time, President Kennedy publicly called on Nikita Khrushchev to remove the weapons and stop the ships from crossing the Atlantic. In September 1962, President Kennedy had stated and Congress had passed a resolution saying that if the Soviet Union placed offensive first strike weapons in Cuba, that the American people and the American government would not tolerate it. President Kennedy determined in his first 48 hours of the Cuban Missile Crisis that the removal of missiles was the primary objective, not invading Cuba, not removing Fidel Castro as leader. On October 23rd, Premier Khrushchev refuses to acknowledge the blockade or presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba. On October 24th, the first Soviet ships, accompanied by submarines, approached the exclusion zone. October 24th, 1962, 10:32 a.m., Soviet ships approaching Cuba in the Atlantic Ocean suddenly stop and turn around. On October 25th, aerial photos show continued construction of missile sites on the island of Cuba. On October 26th, President Kennedy receives a letter offering to negotiate over the missiles in Cuba with removal of the naval blockade and the U.S. invasion threat. And on October 27th, President Kennedy receives a second letter calling for withdrawal of U.S. missiles in Turkey and Italy. During this time, President Kennedy gathered his top officials to come up with a plan to get out of the crisis. Government officials and military commanders urged a direct strike on the missile silos in Cuba. President Kennedy decided on a naval blockade instead, calling it a quarantine around Cuba to prevent the arrival of any additional Soviet missiles. President Kennedy also threatened to invade Cuba if the missiles were not withdrawn. Soviet commanders in Cuba prepared to defend their island. This crisis became the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. After several days of extreme tension, Premier Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles, with the United States pledging never to invade Cuba. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, U.S. and Soviet leaders set up a special hotline telephone for direct access between both heads of state, the U.S. President and the Soviet Premier. They also agreed to a treaty banning further nuclear testing except for underground testing. Senior aide to President Kennedy, Theodore or Teddy Sorensen, said that Tuesday, the first of 13 days of decision unlike any other in the Kennedy years, or indeed, inasmuch as this was the first direct nuclear confrontation, unlike any other in the history of our planet. Premier Khrushchev quoted as saying, I found myself in the difficult position of having to decide on a course of action which would answer the American threat, but which would also avoid war. Any fool can start a war, and once he's done so, even the wisest of men are helpless to stop it, especially if it's a nuclear war. So what was the overall outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis? Cuba remained communist and heavily armed, though without nuclear missiles. Both heads of state, President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, didn't lose face and came away with concessions. The US removed its missiles in Turkey and Italy. The Soviet Union removed their missiles in Cuba. They established a permanent hotline between the White House and the Kremlin, and this helped give support to the theory of containment and coexistence in the world because the alternatives were unimaginable. Those alternatives being mutually assured destruction and all out nuclear war.